The river came up so fast that the ferry bell was still ringing warning when the first wagon went under. Henry Wells heard it from the ridge trail above Cedar Crossing, a sound like a church bell gone mad, and he put his heels to the borrowed horse before he had decided to do anything at all. 2 months of walking and riding and sleeping under wet pine had taught him that a man's body sometimes knew the right thing before his mind caught up, and his body was already moving toward the water. Below him, the Chehalis had swallowed its banks whole. Brown water churned through the willows and around the pilings of the ferry landing, carrying branches and a hen coop and worse, carrying a wagon with 2 mules screaming and a family clinging to the high side of the box. The current had it sideways against the ferry cable, and every second it leaned closer to rolling. A man in a tin star was already chest deep in the flood, fighting toward the wagon with a coil of rope over one shoulder and losing the fight. He went under once, came up spitting, and the rope slipped from his grip and spun away downstream. Henry did not think about the fact that he did not know this town, or this river, or this sheriff. He swung down, looped his own picket rope twice around the saddle horn, tied the other end around his waist with a bowline his father had taught him on a Missouri creek 20 years before, and went into the water. The cold hit him like a fist. He kept his feet downstream the way rivermen had told him once in a logging camp, letting the current carry him rather than fighting it head-on, and he caught the drowning lawman by the collar just as the current tried to take him under the wagon wheel. "Grab the rope," Henry shouted, and the sheriff, gasping, wrapped both fists into the wet hemp. Henry turned his shoulder into the current and kicked for the wagon. A young woman had climbed onto the seat, holding a baby high above the water with white-knuckled arms, and a boy of perhaps 10 clung to her skirts, crying without sound because he had no breath left to cry with. Henry got a hand on the wagon box, then on the boy's collar, then pushed the boy up and over toward the sheriff, who had found his feet on a submerged sandbar and could stand chest-deep now, holding the rope taut between himself and the horse above. "The baby first," Henry called to the woman. "Then you, I've got you both." She did not argue. She passed the swaddled child down into his arms as if she had known him her whole life, some instinct in a mother recognizing that a stranger's steady hands were worth more in that moment than any longer acquaintance could have bought. Henry pressed the baby against his chest, felt the small heart hammering against his own ribs, and turned to fight his way back toward the sandbar. It took 3 trips. The wagon finally rolled and broke apart behind them, mules screaming as they were cut free by a rancher who had waded out with a hunting knife between his teeth. But by then the family stood shivering and alive on the flooded bank, and Henry Wells stood beside a half-drowned sheriff, both of them breathing like men who had run 10 miles uphill. The sheriff looked to be somewhere near 40, weathered around the eyes, gray starting at his temples beneath a hat that had lost its shape entirely to the river. He put a hand on Henry's shoulder to steady himself and did not let go right away. "You made that rope trick look easy," he said. "It was not easy." "Learned it wrong the first 3 times," Henry said. "Learned it right the 4th. Elias Marsh," the sheriff said, "sheriff of Cedar Crossing, for whatever that is worth to a man who was drowning 10 minutes ago. Henry Wells, you are not from here." "No, sir." Marsh studied him a long moment, taking in the soaked and threadbare coat, the boots gone soft with too many miles, the way Henry's eyes kept moving to the water as if checking for anyone still out there needing help. It was the look of a man used to sizing up trouble before it found him, and Henry had seen enough lawmen's faces to know exactly what conclusions a tired, cautious man might draw about a stranger who appeared in town on the same afternoon disaster struck. "Well," Marsh finally said, "whatever brought you here, Mr. Wells, you are welcome to stay long enough to dry out." Up and down the bank, the flood was still doing its work. A warehouse of stacked cedar shakes had come apart and sent boards spinning downstream like matchsticks. Somewhere a dog was barking without stopping. And half a block up the muddy Main Street, in front of a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign reading Keent's Fine Sewing and Alterations, a young woman in a soaked gray dress was hauling bolts of fabric up onto a counter 1 armload at a time. fighting a losing battle against water that was already ankle-deep on her floor. Henry saw her before Marsh did, saw the particular fierce concentration of someone trying to save a life's work with her own two hands, and something in his chest, already strained and hollowed by 2 months of walking with no destination, turned over like a wheel catching a new rut. He did not know yet that her name was Meekeen. He only knew that whatever had brought him to Cedar Crossing on the worst possible afternoon, it did not feel entirely like an accident anymore. By the time Henry reached the shop, the water had crept up over the threshold and was licking at a case of buttons and thread that stood too low on its shelf. He did not ask permission. He simply waded in, hoisted the case onto his shoulder, and set it on the counter beside 2 bolts of blue calico Me had already rescued. She spun around, startled, one hand going instinctively to the sewing shears at her belt before she saw that he meant only to help. "You are letting the water in faster with that door open," she said, which was not thank you, but was, Henry thought, probably close enough given the circumstances. "Door's the only light you've got," he said. "Tell me what to save first and I will save it." She looked at him for one long assessing moment, the same kind of look Marsh had given him at the river, and something about being measured twice in 1 hour by 2 strangers who both seemed to know their own minds struck Henry as almost funny, though he did not laugh. "The trunk in the back room," Me said. "It has my aunt's papers in it. Everything else can be replaced with time and thread. That cannot." He went. The back room was darker and the water was higher up past his knees, but he found the trunk by feel more than sight, hauled it up onto a shelf bracket that groaned but held, and came back to find me balanced on a chair, unhooking a dress form draped in a half-finished wedding gown, ivory silk already spotted with muddy water at the hem. "Let me," Henry said, and lifted the dress form down himself, careful of the pins still bristling from the unfinished seams. "You will prick yourself." "Wouldn't be the worst thing that happened to me today." That got the ghost of a smile out of her, quick and startled, as if she had not expected to have room for one. Up close she had brown eyes gone dark with worry and exhaustion, hair coming loose from its pins in wet strands, and a set to her jaw that told Henry she was the kind of woman who did not often let herself be helped, and was not entirely sure what to do with a stranger who simply would not leave until the helping was done. They worked another 20 minutes together, wordless mostly, hauling and stacking, until the worst of the shop's contents sat safe above the waterline. When at last they stood catching their breath in the doorway, watching the brown water swirl in the street where children had been playing that morning, Me finally turned to look at him properly. "I do not believe I know your name," she said. "Henry Wells. Meekeen." She wiped a strand of hair from her face with the back of one wrist, leaving a faint smear of mud on her cheek that Henry did not mention. "You are not from Cedar Crossing." "No, ma'am, passing through mostly, or I was before the river had other plans." "Where were you passing through from?" He hesitated, only a heartbeat, but she caught it, the way careful people always caught the small hesitations in other careful people. "East," he said. "Worked the railroad a while before that." Something shifted in her expression at the word railroad, quick and guarded, gone before he could name it. "Which line?" "Puget Sound and Cascade." Me went very still. "My brother worked that line." Henry's pulse jumped. "Small world if that is true." "Daniel Keene," she said, watching his face now with an intensity that had nothing to do with flood damage. "Did you know him?" The name hit Henry like the cold river water had, a shock that went all the way to the bone. He had carried that name across 2 states and 3 months of wandering, carried it the way a man carries a debt he intends to pay even when he does not know how. "I knew him," Henry said quietly. "I knew him well. He was the reason I came west at all." Me's hand found the doorframe as if she needed it to stay standing. "Do you know where he is?" "Nobody has heard from my brother in 4 months, Mr. Wells. Not one word." "No," Henry admitted, and watched hope drain a little from her face even as something else, something wearier and more determined, rose to take its place. "But I promised him I would find you if anything ever happened to him. I promised him I would look after you, Miss Keene, whatever that turned out to mean. I did not expect to be fishing you out of a flood to keep that promise, but I suppose promises do not always arrive the way a man expects. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the water was already beginning to recede, leaving the street coated in a thick gray silt, and somewhere down the block Sheriff Marsh was shouting instructions to men stacking sandbags too late to matter. "You had better come in out of the wet, Mr. Wells," Mee finally said, her voice unsteady but her spine straight as a fence post. "I think you and I have a great deal to discuss." The flood took 2 days to fully recede and left Cedar Crossing looking like a town that had been picked up and shaken. Fences lay flattened. The lower half of Main Street wore a coat of river mud thick enough to swallow a boot. But the cattle drives that used the crossing every early summer did not wait on weather, and by the third morning, the first bawling herd of the season was already pushing through on its way to the shipping pens upriver, hooves churning the drying mud back into paste, and the town had no choice but to dust itself off and get back to business. Henry spent those 2 days making himself useful in the particular way of a man with nowhere else to be. He helped right an overturned smokehouse. He helped a widow named Odell salvage a chicken coop. He slept in the livery loft on hay that smelled of river silt, and on the second evening, Sheriff Elias Marsh found him there, climbing the ladder with the slow deliberateness of a man whose knees had opinions about ladders. "You have not left town," Marsh said by way of greeting. "Wasn't in any hurry to go anywhere in particular." Marsh settled himself on an overturned feed bucket, wincing slightly, the flood having left its own marks on him. "I asked around some. A man matching your description had some trouble down near Chehalis 3 months back, accused of taking money that went missing from a railroad paymaster's box." Henry's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "I did not take that money. I did not say you did. Foreman by the name of Otis Bragg accused me of it 2 days after I told the district superintendent that Bragg was letting a cattle outfit doctor the survey stakes along the new right-of-way, running the line closer to certain ranches than it ought to run, and further from others, depending on who had paid him. I was fired the same week. The money went missing the week after. I never saw a dollar of it, and I never got the chance to prove that before I was told to leave the county or be arrested for it." Marsh was quiet a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. "That is a serious accusation to make against a railroad foreman." "It is a true one," Henry said. "I have got nothing left to gain by lying about it now, Sheriff. I have got no job, no money, and no home to speak of. If you mean to run me out of Cedar Crossing on the strength of a rumor, you go right ahead. I will not fight you on it, but I did not steal that money, and I did not lie about what I saw." Something in the plain, tired honesty of it seemed to satisfy Marsh more than any defense could have. He had spent 20 years reading men's faces across a jailhouse desk, and he knew the particular flavor of a man telling the truth about something that had cost him everything to tell. "You pulled me out of that river without knowing one thing about me," Marsh said slowly. "You did not stop to ask if I was worth the risk. Most men would have thought twice. Didn't seem like there was time to think twice." "No," Marsh agreed. "There was not." He stood, knees cracking audibly, and looked down at Henry with an expression that was not quite a smile but was heading in that direction. "I am not in the habit of handing out second chances to drifters, Mr. Wells. Cedar Crossing has had enough trouble with men passing through who were running from something worse than a rumor. But I have also lived long enough to know the difference between a man running from his own guilt and a man running from somebody else's. Which do you take me for? The second kind, for now." Marsh clapped a hand on his shoulder, not unlike the way Henry had gripped his collar in the flood. "There is work needs doing around here that has nothing to do with your railroad troubles. I could use a man to help clear debris, mend fence, keep an eye on things while this town gets back on its feet. It does not pay much, but it is honest, and nobody in Cedar Crossing needs to know a thing about Chehalis unless you choose to tell them." It was, Henry understood, an offer of far more than day labor. It was a hand extended to a man the world had decided was not worth trusting, offered by someone who had every reason to be careful and chose generosity instead. Henry had spent 3 months feeling like a burr caught in the world's coat, brushed off wherever he landed. He had not expected Cedar Crossing, of all muddy, flood-battered places, to be where somebody finally let him stay. "I will not give you cause to regret it," Henry said. "See that you do not," Marsh said, and climbed back down the ladder, leaving Henry alone in the loft with the smell of wet hay and the first real hope he had felt in a long while. 2 weeks passed in the particular rhythm of a town rebuilding itself. Henry mended fence for the widow Odell and helped rebuild the ferry landing plank by plank. And in the evenings he took to eating supper at Mee Keen's kitchen table above her shop, because she had insisted on it the first time, saying a man who had saved her aunt's papers from the flood had earned at least one honest meal, and the habit had simply continued from there without either of them quite deciding to make it a habit. It was over one of those suppers, a plate of pan bread and beans and good strong coffee, that Mee finally asked him to tell her everything he knew about her brother. "He wrote to me before he disappeared," Henry said. Said he had found something in the survey ledgers that did not sit right, brand records that had been altered, cattle bought from small ranchers on paper, but the ranchers swore they had never sold a single head. He said a man named Virgil Hatch was behind it, using the new rail spur as cover, buying up land cheap from ranchers who thought they were behind on debts they had never actually owed, then reselling the same cattle at auction under a clean brand. Mee's hands had gone very still around her coffee cup. "Virgil Hatch is the most respected cattleman in 3 counties, Mr. Wells. He sits on the county land commission. He donated the bell for the new church. I do not doubt he has made himself agreeable to a great many people," Henry said. "That is usually how a man gets away with something like this for as long as your brother says it has been going on. You keep calling him my brother as though you know for certain he is still." She stopped, could not finish the sentence, and Henry reached across the table without entirely meaning to and covered her hand with his own. "I do not know for certain of anything, Mee," he said, using her given name for the first time, and neither of them commented on it. "But your brother was careful. He was not a man to walk into danger blind. He told me if anything happened to him, I was to come find you, warn you, and make sure whatever inheritance your aunt left you did not fall into the wrong hands while you were left to defend it alone. I intend to keep that promise, whatever it takes." Mee did not pull her hand away. "My Aunt Vesta left me this shop, and the lot of land behind it that runs down to the creek. Mr. Hatch's lawyer has already sent 2 letters claiming the deed my aunt held was superseded by an older claim his syndicate holds, dating back before the town was even platted. He says the land is rightfully part of a parcel he intends to include in the county's delinquent property auction come July." "Is there truth to his claim?" "I do not know," Mee admitted. "I have gone through every paper my aunt left me and found nothing that answers it either way. But I know my Aunt Vesta, Mr. Wells. She was not a careless woman. If there was a hole in her claim to this land, she would have found it and mended it long before she died. I do not believe for one moment that Virgil Hatch has an honest claim to anything of mine." "Then we will prove it," Henry said, with more confidence than he entirely felt, though the saying of it steadied something in his own chest. The following week, Sheriff Marsh's deputy of 6 years, a quiet man named Purdy, turned in his badge without warning and left town on the morning stage, telling no one why, though the rumor that reached Henry by suppertime was that Purdy had been seen taking supper with one of Hatch's foremen the night before, and had looked, by all accounts, like a man who had been given a choice he did not care to make twice. Marsh posted the deputy job the same afternoon, tacking a notice to the board outside the jailhouse in his own square, careful handwriting, and Henry read it 3 times standing in the street before he made up his mind. He found Marsh at his desk that evening, oiling the county's spare rifle with the methodical patience of a man who did small chores to keep his hands busy while his mind worked over larger troubles. "I want the deputy job," Henry said without preamble. Marsh looked up, one eyebrow raised. "You have been in this town 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which you have fed me, trusted me, and given me the first honest chance I have had in half a year. I am not going to repay that by drifting off the moment something better comes along, because nothing better is going to come along, Sheriff. Whatever is happening with Hatch and this syndicate of his, whatever happened to Daniel Keene, I intend to be standing beside you when it comes to a head. I would rather do that wearing a badge than without one. This town's last 2 deputies either quit or were run off," Marsh said. "Purdy is not the first man Hatch's money has bent sideways. If you take this badge, you are painting a target on your own back, and you will not have the option of drifting away quietly if it gets too hot." "I have not had the option of drifting away quietly since the day I read Daniel's letter," Henry said. "I am not asking because I think it will be easy, Sheriff. I am asking because you are the first man in a long while who looked at me and saw something worth trusting instead of something worth running off. I mean to stay close enough to be worth that trust." Marsh set down the rifle and studied him for a long, quiet moment, the same weighing look from the riverbank, except this time there was warmth behind it, the particular pride of a man who had gambled on a stranger and was beginning to see the gamble pay out. "All right, Henry Wells," he said, and it was the first time he had used Henry's given name. "Raise your right hand." The swearing-in was small and plain, just the 2 of them in a jailhouse office that still smelled faintly of river mud. But Henry felt the weight of the tin star settle onto his coat like something with real gravity to it, pulling him down into Cedar Crossing in a way 3 months of wandering never had. He did not tell Marsh that evening that a good half of his reason for wanting the badge had brown eyes and a sewing shop above which he had started taking most of his suppers. He suspected the sheriff already knew and was kind enough not to say so. Summer settled over Cedar Crossing in earnest through June, bringing longer days and heavier traffic on the roads as cattle drives pushed through toward the rail shipping pens, dust rising in yellow clouds behind every herd, wagon trains rattling through at all hours loaded with settlers and freight bound for the timber camps further up the valley. It was, Marsh told Henry, the busiest season of the year for trouble, and the 2 of them spent long days settling disputes over grazing rights and broken wagon axles and drovers who drank too much at the Cedar Crossing saloon and forgot themselves. But beneath the ordinary business of a frontier town in early summer, Henry and Marsh were quietly building a case. Henry spent his evenings poring over county brand records at the recorder's office, comparing dates and signatures with the small, careful notes Daniel Keene had left behind in a battered notebook Me produced from her aunt's trunk, the same trunk Henry had hauled to safety during the flood. The notebook was not proof of anything on its own, just numbers and dates and a few cryptic initials, but it was enough to show a pattern if a man knew what he was looking for. Corwin Pratt, the county recorder, was a nervous, soft-handed man who sweated even on cool days and always seemed eager to help Henry find whatever he was looking for. A little too eager, Henry thought, the way a man is eager when he wants to know exactly how much you already know. "These 3 brand transfers," Henry said one afternoon, laying 3 ledger pages side by side on Pratt's counter, "all filed the same week, all signed off by the same witness. Man named Silas Co. Co rides for Mr. Hatch," Pratt said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Perfectly respectable witness for a transfer. Funny thing is, 2 of these 3 ranchers swear they never sold a head of cattle that month. I talked to both of them myself." Henry kept his voice easy, conversational, the way he had learned to draw information out of frightened men during his railroad days. "You would not happen to remember anything unusual about these particular filings, would you, Mr. Pratt?" Pratt's hand trembled slightly as he gathered the ledger pages back into a neat stack. "I file what is brought to me, deputy. I do not question every man who walks through that door. It is not my place." "No," Henry agreed. I do not suppose it is. But he filed away the tremble in Pratt's hand the same way he filed away everything else. A small stone added to a growing pile that was beginning, slowly, to take the shape of a wall. It was on one of those long summer evenings, riding back from a ranch outside town, where he had gone to take a statement from a man named Osgood, who swore Hatch's syndicate had claimed 40 head of his cattle under a forged bill of sale, that the sky opened up on Henry Wells in a way that had nothing to do with the flood 2 months past. Mountain weather in early summer could turn in the space of an hour, and this storm came down off the Cascades like something with a grudge, thunder rolling between the peaks and rain coming sideways hard enough to sting. He had promised to check on me that evening, to walk with her back from the church social where she had gone to deliver a mended altar cloth, and he found her a mile outside town, sheltering beneath a stand of cedar with her shawl already soaked through, her lantern guttering in the wind. "You are a sight for sore eyes," she called over the storm, half laughing despite the misery of it. "I was beginning to think I would have to wade home." "Come on," Henry said, swinging down and helping her up behind his saddle. "There is a line shack up this draw belongs to old Osgood. He will not mind us borrowing it out of a storm like this." The shack was small, one room with a stone hearth and a few sacks of grain stacked against the wall, but it was dry, and Henry had them a fire going within a quarter hour, the two of them steaming gently in the growing warmth while the storm hammered at the shingled roof outside. "You are shivering," Henry said, noticing the way her hands would not quite stay still. "I am cold, Henry Wells, that is all. Do not go making it into more than it is." But he draped his own dry coat over her shoulders anyway, and she did not argue, and for a while they simply sat by the fire listening to the rain, close enough that Henry could feel the warmth coming off her, close enough that the silence between them had begun to feel like its own kind of conversation. "Can I ask you something?" Me said finally, staring into the fire rather than at him. "And you will tell me true. I will always tell you true. Do you believe my brother is alive?" Henry considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe Daniel was too careful and too smart to be caught easily," he said. "I believe whatever happened to him, he did not go without a fight, and he did not go without leaving some kind of trail behind for anyone patient enough to look for it. Whether that means he is alive right now tonight I cannot promise you, but I have not given up believing it and I do not intend to." Me's eyes, when she finally looked at him, were bright with unshed tears she was too proud to let fall. "I have been so afraid to hope," she said. "It seemed safer not to." "But you keep making it hard not to hope, Henry Wells. You keep showing up in the middle of my worst days and making me believe things might come out right after all." "Maybe that is what I am here for," Henry said quietly. She studied his face in the firelight for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither of them had words ready for, some current as sudden and undeniable as the flood that had first thrown them together. When me leaned toward him, it was a small movement, barely more than a shift of weight, but Henry met her the rest of the way, and the kiss that followed was slow and searching and entirely unhurried, the kind of kiss two careful people give each other when they have finally decided that carefulness is not the same thing as safety. When they broke apart, me let out a small, unsteady laugh. "I did not intend for that to happen tonight. I have been intending it for a while," Henry admitted, "and trying very hard not to let on. You did a poor job of hiding it. I never claimed to be subtle, only steady." She smiled properly then, the first full, unguarded smile he had seen from her since the flood, and settled her head against his shoulder while the storm raged on outside. And Henry thought that whatever trouble waited for them beyond that little line shack, whatever Hatch and his forged ledgers and missing men still had in store, he would face every bit of it gladly if it meant more evenings like this one. They rode back into Cedar Crossing the following morning once the storm had blown itself out and found trouble waiting for them at Me's shop. Someone had broken the front window in the night. Mud and manure had been smeared across the door, and a crude message scrawled in charcoal across the boards read simply, "Sell or burn." Me went white, then furious in the space of a single breath. "Cowards," she spat, stepping through the broken glass to survey the damage. "Whoever did this did not even have the courage to face me in daylight." Henry crouched to examine the tracks in the mud outside the door, still fresh from the rain. "Two horses, shod the same way. Look here." He pointed to a distinctive nick in one hoofprint. "That is a split shoe. I have seen that mark before on a horse tied outside the Hatch Line camp 2 weeks back." Sheriff Marsh arrived within the hour, summoned by a neighbor, and studied the message with the grim expression of a man who had feared exactly this kind of escalation. "This is no longer a matter of disputed paper," Marsh said. "This is intimidation, plain and simple, and I intend to treat it as the crime it is." He turned to Henry. "Ride out to the Hatch spread. Ask after any hands who might have been out riding last night with a horse throwing a split shoe. Do it careful, and do not accuse anybody outright. We want evidence, not a fight we cannot win in front of a judge." Henry rode out that same afternoon and found what he expected to find: a foreman named Silas Coe, the same man whose signature had appeared on those questionable brand transfers, currently having his horse reshod at the ranch's own smithy, a fresh split visible in the old shoe the smith was in the process of replacing. "That is quite a coincidence," Henry said mildly, watching the smith work. "A split shoe just happens to match tracks left outside a break-in and vandalism in town last night." Coe's eyes narrowed. "You accusing me of something, deputy?" "Just noting a coincidence." "I expect the sheriff will want to note it too when he comes to ask you some questions." "You are new in this county," Coe said, stepping closer, close enough that Henry could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "New men who go poking their noses into Mr. Hatch's business tend not to stay new men in this county for very long. You understand my meaning?" "I understand it fine," Henry said, not backing away an inch. "I understand it is a threat, and I understand threatening a deputy is its own kind of crime, on top of whatever else you and your split-shoed horse got up to last night. You might mention that to Mr. Hatch next time you see him. Tell him the sheriff sends his regards and his questions." He rode back to town with the information, and though Marsh could not yet prove Coe's involvement to a judge's satisfaction, the confrontation had confirmed what both men already suspected. Hatch knew they were closing in, and he intended to fight dirty to protect whatever he had built. That fight came to a head 3 days later, in a way none of them had fully anticipated. Henry had gone to the jailhouse early that morning to find the door standing open and the lock forced, the strongbox where Marsh kept the growing collection of evidence, Daniel's notebook included, sitting empty on the floor. Marsh arrived minutes later, face gray with fury and something close to despair. "Somebody knew exactly what to look for and exactly where to find it," Marsh said, kneeling by the broken lock. "This was no random break-in." "Pratt," Henry said grimly. "He is the only man besides you and me who knew we kept the notebook here." They confronted Pratt that same hour, and the recorder folded almost immediately, weeping with the particular relief of a frightened man finally allowed to stop lying. "Hatch has held a note over my head for 2 years, Pratt confessed, sitting slumped at his own desk. "A debt from before I took this post. He said if I did not tell him what you two were finding, he would call the note due and ruin me. I am sorry, Sheriff. I am truly sorry, but I did not know what else to do." "You are going to help us make this right," Marsh said, not unkindly, "or you are going to answer for obstruction in front of a judge alongside Hatch himself. Those are the only 2 paths left open to you now, Corwin." Pratt chose, wisely, the first path, and began that same afternoon writing out everything he knew of Hatch's dealings, every forged transfer he had been pressured to file, every threat he had received. It was not the stolen evidence, but it was something, a fresh thread to pull. And it was Pratt, 3 days later, sweating and nervous but determined to make amends, who told them where to look next. "There is a line camp up past Timber Ridge," Pratt said, "on the old Sorensen claim. Hatch's men have been keeping it quiet, hardly anybody goes up there. I heard Ko mention it once, said something about keeping a guest comfortable so he would not wander off and cause trouble before the auction. Me, who had insisted on being present for the conversation despite Marsh's initial objections, gripped the edge of the desk hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "A guest," she repeated. "You think that is my brother?" "I think it is worth riding up there and finding out," Henry said. The county commissioner allied with Hatch, a portly man named Vance Ruddock, had by then gotten wind of the investigation and paid Marsh a visit at the jailhouse, all false warmth and thinly veiled threats, suggesting that a sheriff who spent too much time harassing respectable citizens like Mr. Hatch might find himself unable to secure the county's confidence come the next election. Marsh had thrown him out bodily, an act that earned him no friends on the commission but plenty of quiet respect from the small ranchers who had begun, one by one, to come forward with their own stories of altered brands and missing cattle. Timber Ridge sat 2 hours' ride into the foothills, a steep switchback trail through stands of cedar and hemlock, so thick the midday light barely reached the ground. Henry and me rode together, with Marsh a half-mile behind bringing 2 more men deputized for the occasion, and the closer they came to the old Sorensen claim, the tighter me's jaw grew, the more her hands trembled on the reins despite her best efforts to hide it. "Whatever we find up there," Henry said quietly, riding close beside her, "I am not leaving your side." "I know," me said. "That is the only reason I have not turned back 3 times already." They found the line camp exactly where Pratt had described it, a squat cabin with a lean-to for horses, smoke rising thin from its chimney. 2 of Hatch's men lounged outside on a bench, rifles close at hand, and the moment they spotted riders approaching, both men reached for their weapons. "Sheriff's business," Henry called out, badge catching the light as he raised one hand, the other resting near his own revolver. "Stand easy." "Ain't nothing here for the sheriff," one of the men said, a lanky rider Henry did not recognize. "This is private land." "Private land does not usually come with an armed guard," Henry said. "We know there is a man being held here against his will. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard, but either way we are not leaving without him." The standoff held for a long, taut moment, both riders clearly weighing whether their loyalty to Hatch's wages was worth a gunfight against a deputy and an approaching sheriff. In the end, cowardice won out over loyalty, as it usually does when the money is not quite enough. The lanky rider lowered his rifle first, and his partner followed suit a heartbeat later. "He is inside," the rider muttered. "Ain't been treated bad, mind, just kept from wandering off." Henry did not wait for further explanation. He pushed through the cabin door with me right behind him despite his instinct to keep her back, and found a man chained by one ankle to an iron ring bolted into the floor, thin and pale from weeks of confinement but very much alive, his eyes going wide with disbelief at the sight of his sister standing in the doorway. "Me," Daniel Keene said, his voice cracking. "Me, is that really you?" Me crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to her knees beside him, sobbing his name, and Henry stood back, throat tight, watching the reunion he had traveled 3 months and 200 miles to help make possible. They broke the chain with a fence tool from Osgood's saddlebag and carried Daniel out into the daylight, weak but grinning through cracked lips, and Marsh arrived minutes later to place both of Hatch's guards under arrest, their protests dying quickly once they understood the full weight of what they had been complicit in. "You found me," Daniel said to Henry, once he had been given water and a blanket and helped onto the back of Marsh's own horse for the ride home. "I did not think anybody would." "I made you a promise," Henry said simply. "I do not break promises I make to friends." "Nor do I," Daniel said, glancing between Henry and his sister with an expression that suggested he had already guessed at more than either of them had said aloud. "I take it a great deal has happened since I have been away." "A great deal," me agreed, and did not let go of her brother's hand the entire ride back down the mountain. Daniel Keene needed 3 days of rest and me's careful nursing before he was strong enough to tell his story in full, and when he did, sitting up in bed in the small room above the shop with color slowly returning to his face. The shape of Hatch's fraud finally came into complete focus. "I found the pattern 6 months ago," Daniel said. Hatch's syndicate was using the new rail survey as cover to claim ranches were behind on county assessments. They had never actually incurred forged debts backed by falsified ledger entries Pratt was pressured into filing. Once a rancher's land was declared delinquent, it went to public auction, where Hatch's syndicate was the only serious bidder. Since word had a way of getting around that anybody who outbid Hatch tended to have accidents with their fences and their cattle afterward. He was set to do the same thing to Aunt Vesta's land, except Aunt Vesta was smarter than he counted on. "What do you mean?" Me asked. "She knew something was wrong before she died," Daniel said. "She wrote to me about it," said Hatch's lawyer had come sniffing around asking questions about her deed, trying to find some flaw in it. "She told me she had taken steps to protect the land, but she never told me what those steps were. I was trying to find proof of the whole scheme when Coe and 2 other riders caught me on the road outside Timber Ridge and dragged me up to that cabin. I have been there ever since, waiting for a chance to escape that never came." "Steps to protect the land," Henry repeated slowly, turning the phrase over. "Me, do you still have everything from your aunt's trunk?" "Of course. Everything, every scrap of paper, every letter." Me's brow furrowed, and then, slowly, understanding dawned in her eyes. She rose without a word and disappeared into the back room, returning minutes later with the same battered trunk Henry had hauled to safety during the flood. She went through it methodically this time, laying out letters and receipts and old newspaper clippings, and near the very bottom, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, she found a quilt Henry recognized as one she had shown him once before, a wedding ring pattern in faded blues and creams that Me had said her Aunt Vesta had begun stitching years ago and never finished. "She never finished this," Me murmured, running her fingers over the uneven stitching along one border, stitching that looked, now that Henry examined it closely, less like an unfinished pattern and more like something deliberately sewn shut. "May I?" Henry asked, and at Me's nod, drew his pocket knife and carefully worked the blade beneath the crooked stitches along the quilt's border. Inside, folded flat and protected between 2 layers of muslin, they found a copy of the original deed to Vesta Keene's land, dated a full decade before any claim Hatch's syndicate could produce, along with a sworn affidavit in Vesta's own careful hand describing her suspicions about the syndicate's dealings, and a list of names, Hatch's name among them, connected to falsified transfers going back years. "She hid it in her sewing," Me whispered, tears standing in her eyes. "She knew, and she hid it where she knew I would eventually find it, because she knew I would never let this quilt go unfinished forever." "Your aunt was a clever woman," Henry said softly. "She raised a clever niece," Daniel added, managing a weak smile from his sickbed. "This is it, Me. This is everything we need." Word of the county's delinquent property auction had been posted for weeks, scheduled for the second Saturday of July on the courthouse steps in Cedar Crossing, and it had drawn attention from every corner of the valley, small ranchers and curious townsfolk alike gathering to see which parcels of land would change hands and for how much. Hatch's syndicate had quietly ensured, through Pratt's forced cooperation before his conscience finally won out, that a dozen parcels belonging to small ranchers, along with Me Keene's shop and land, were listed among the delinquent properties to be sold that day. Now, with the deed and affidavit in hand, Marsh moved quickly. He sent word by fast rider to the Territorial Land Office in Olympia, requesting that an official observer attend the auction given the serious allegations of fraud, and received back a terse but promising reply. A land office examiner named Whitfield would arrive on the Friday stage, along with a circuit judge already scheduled to pass through the county on other business that same week. The small ranchers who had lost cattle to Hatch's altered brands were gathered too, one, by Henry riding out to each ranch in turn, collecting sworn statements, building a case that could not be dismissed as the grudge of one aggrieved family. By the morning of the auction, Cedar Crossing's Main Street was packed tighter than Henry had ever seen it, wagons and horses crowding every available space. The courthouse steps themselves ringed with townsfolk and ranchers, and curious drovers passing through with their cattle. Virgil Hatch stood near the front in a fine gray coat, silver watch chain glinting, looking every bit the respected cattleman me had described, smiling and shaking hands as though he had not a single worry in the world. Henry stood near the courthouse steps in his deputy's badge, me beside him in her best dress, Daniel still pale but upright between his sister and Sheriff Marsh, the recovered documents secured in a leather satchel that me herself had insisted on carrying, saying she had earned the right to hold her aunt's proof in her own 2 hands. The county auctioneer, a nervous man named Fitch who clearly wished he were anywhere else, climbed the steps and called the crowd to order, reading the list of delinquent properties in a droning voice. When he reached the Keene parcel, describing it in flat legal language as forfeit for unpaid assessment, to be sold to the highest bidder, Hatch himself stepped forward, ready to open the bidding. "I object to this sale," Keene said, her voice ringing clear and steady across the crowded square before Fitch could even finish his sentence. A murmur ran through the gathered townsfolk. Hatch's smile did not waver, though something cold entered his eyes. "My dear Miss Keene," he said smoothly, "I understand this must be difficult, but the county's assessment is a matter of public record. I am afraid sentiment cannot overturn a legal debt." "There is no debt," me said, climbing the courthouse steps herself now, Henry and Daniel close behind her, the examiner Whitfield and the circuit judge, a stern-faced man named Judge Aldous Pemberton, watching with sharpened interest from where they had positioned themselves near the courthouse door. "My Aunt Vesta Keene held clear and rightful title to this land 10 years before your syndicate ever filed a competing claim. I have the original deed here, along with a sworn statement detailing the fraud your syndicate has perpetrated against a dozen ranching families in this county, myself included." She drew the deed and affidavit from the satchel and held them high enough for the crowd and the judge alike to see. A ripple of shock moved through the gathered townsfolk, and Hatch's composed expression finally cracked, fury flashing raw and unguarded across his face before he mastered himself again. "This is preposterous," Hatch said, his voice rising. "A forgery, clearly, cooked up by a grieving young woman and her outlaw deputy friend to avoid an honest debt." "I would be careful throwing around the word forgery, Mr. Hatch," Judge Pemberton said, stepping forward now, his voice carrying easily across the hushed crowd. "Given that examiner Whitfield here has already begun comparing the filing dates on your syndicate's claim against county records that Recorder Pratt has, in the last week, sworn were altered under duress at your direction." Pratt himself stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, visibly trembling but resolute, and confirmed as much before the judge and the assembled townsfolk, his testimony the final crack in the dam. Hatch's foreman, Silas Coe, standing near the back of the crowd with 2 other hired riders, seemed to sense the tide turning irreversibly against his employer, and made the poor decision to act on it. He shoved forward through the crowd, hand going for his revolver, shouting something about not letting a deputy and a seamstress ruin what Hatch had built. Henry saw the movement before most of the crowd did, and moved without hesitation, closing the distance and driving his shoulder into Coe's chest before the gun could clear its holster, the 2 of them going down hard onto the courthouse steps in a tangle of limbs. It was brief and ugly and over in seconds, Henry pinning Coe's gun arm with his knee, while Marsh arrived to snap iron cuffs around both wrists, the crowd gasping and surging back from the sudden violence. "That," Marsh said, hauling Coe roughly to his feet, "is attempted assault on a peace officer, on top of everything else, Mr. Coe. You have made my case a great deal easier." Hatch, seeing his own hired man's desperation laid bare in front of the judge and the entire assembled town, seemed finally to understand that the ground beneath him had well and truly given way. He made one last attempt at dignity, straightening his coat, opening his mouth as if to offer some final defense, but Judge Pemberton cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Hatch, given the evidence presented here today, I am ordering an immediate halt to this auction pending a full county investigation into your syndicate's dealings. I am further ordering your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, to be tried at the earliest possible session of this court. Sheriff Marsh, if you would." Marsh stepped forward with visible satisfaction and placed a second pair of cuffs around Virgil Hatch's wrists, the silver watch chain catching the sunlight one last time before Hatch was led away through a crowd that had, in the space of 20 minutes, transformed from curious onlookers into a chorus of small ranchers finally seeing justice arrive for grievances some of them had carried for years. Fitch the auctioneer, looking equal parts relieved and bewildered, announced that the sale of the Keene parcel, along with every other property connected to Hatch's fraudulent claims, was rescinded effective immediately, the original deeds and rightful ownership to be restored pending the court's final review, a review that Judge Pemberton assured the crowd would move swiftly given the weight of evidence already presented. The crowd erupted into noise then, some cheering, some still murmuring in shocked disbelief. Ranchers Henry had interviewed over the past weeks clasping each other's hands with the particular relief of men who had feared losing everything and found, at the last possible moment, that the ground beneath them was solid after all. Me stood at the center of it, the deed still clutched in her hands, tears streaming freely down her face now that the danger had passed, Daniel's arm around her shoulders, and when she looked up and found Henry's eyes across the chaos of the courthouse steps, something passed between them that needed no words at all. It took the better part of 2 hours for the crowd to fully disperse, for statements to be gathered, and Hatch and his foreman secured properly in the jailhouse, for Judge Pemberton to confer with Examiner Whitfield about the particulars of the coming investigation, for a dozen small ranchers to shake Henry's hand and thank him with a warmth that left him almost embarrassed by its intensity. Daniel Keene, still weak but glowing with the particular joy of a man who had finally seen his months of suffering bear fruit, was carried home on a borrowed cart by 2 ranchers eager to see him properly settled, insisting me stay behind long enough to see the last of the day's business concluded, since, as one grizzled old rancher named Trout put it, she had more than earned the right to watch Virgil Hatch's fine gray coat disappear behind jailhouse bars. By the time the courthouse square finally emptied, the sun was beginning its long slide toward the western ridgeline, painting the timbered mountains gold and rose, and me Keene stood alone on the courthouse steps, still holding the leather satchel that had carried her aunt's proof, watching the last of the wagons rattle away down Main Street. Henry found her there, having finally seen Hatch and Co. both properly locked in separate cells, and Marsh settled with the paperwork that would keep the county recorder's office honest for years to come. "It is done," Henry said, climbing the steps to stand beside her. "Really and truly done. I keep waiting to feel it," me said softly. "All these weeks I have been so afraid, so certain something else would go wrong, and now it has not, and I do not quite know what to do with myself." "You could start by sitting down," Henry suggested, and she laughed, a real laugh this time, unburdened and settled onto the top step beside him, the leather satchel finally set down between them. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the light change over the valley, the last cattle drive of the day pushing slowly through the ford outside town, dust rising gold in the late sun. "Daniel will need weeks yet to fully recover," me said eventually. "But he is alive, and he is home, and he tells me he means to stay in Cedar Crossing this time, take up ranching properly instead of chasing railroad wages across 3 territories. I am glad to hear it. He deserves some peace after everything." "We all do," me said, and turned to look at him properly, her expression softening into something Henry had only glimpsed before in flashes, during the storm at Osgood's line shack, and in the moment she had first pressed the deed into Judge Pemberton's astonished hands. "You never did answer me properly, you know. Back at the beginning. Whether you came to Cedar Crossing to keep a promise to my brother or for some other reason entirely." "I came to keep the promise," Henry said honestly. "That much is true, but I stayed me, and I took that deputy badge, and I have spent every day since trying to find some excuse to sit at your table for supper, for reasons that stopped having anything to do with your brother a long while back." "How long a while back?" "Somewhere around the third time you told me my rope work was clumsy, and then let me carry your dress form anyway." Me's laugh was soft and warm in the fading light. "I never once said your rope work was clumsy. You implied it with your eyebrows. That is not the same thing at all." But she was smiling as she said it, and she reached over to take his hand where it rested on the step between them, lacing her fingers through his without hesitation this time. No storm needed to excuse the closeness. "I have spent so long being careful, Henry Wells. Careful with my shop, careful with my aunt's memory, careful never to hope for too much because hoping too much only makes the losing hurt worse. But you have made it very difficult to stay careful these past weeks." "I do not want you careful with me," Henry said quietly. "I want you certain. Are you asking me to be certain of something in particular?" "I am asking you to be certain that whatever comes next in this town, whatever trials and investigations and new fences need building, I intend to be standing right beside you through all of it. Not because I promised your brother I would. Because I love you, me keen. And I do not know when it happened exactly, only that it did, somewhere between a flooded street and a mountain-lined shack and 100 suppers I found every excuse in the world to stay for." Me's eyes shone bright in the amber light, and she did not make him wait for an answer. "I love you too, Henry Wells. I think I have for longer than I let myself admit. You arrived in the middle of the worst day this town has seen in years, and instead of running from the trouble, you waded straight into it, and you have not stopped wading into my troubles since. A woman could search a long while and not find a man willing to do that twice, let alone as many times as you have." He kissed her then, there on the empty courthouse steps with the whole town finally quiet around them, the last light of the day settling gold over the mountains, and it was not rushed or uncertain the way their first kiss in the storm had been. It was slow and sure and full of promise, the kind of kiss two people share when they have already decided, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever came next, they intended to face it together. When they finally broke apart, Me rested her forehead against his, both of them smiling like a couple of fools with no audience left to mind. "I suppose," she said, "if you truly mean to stay in Cedar Crossing wearing that badge, you will need somewhere respectable to take your meals. I have grown rather fond of a particular kitchen above a particular sewing shop." "Then perhaps," Me said, "you ought to make it official. Marry the seamstress instead of merely eating her cooking." Henry laughed, delighted and a little breathless. "Was that a proposal, Miss Keene?" "I believe it may have been. I am given to understand you are the marrying kind, Deputy Wells, given how thoroughly you have attached yourself to this town already." "I am exactly the marrying kind," Henry said, "provided the bride is you." He drew back just far enough to look at her properly, his heart so full he could hardly find words adequate to it. "Me keen, I would be honored, more honored than I have any right to be, to marry you." "Then it is settled," Me said, laughing through fresh tears, happy ones this time, and Henry gathered her into his arms right there on the courthouse steps where the whole business had reached its resolution. The two of them wrapped together in the gold light of a July evening, while somewhere down the street a fiddle started up, some rancher or drover celebrating the day's justice with music, the sound drifting warm and sweet across a town that had, in the space of one long summer, given a drifter a home, a sheriff a partner he could trust completely, and two careful, lonely people the one thing neither of them had quite dared to hope for: each other, safe and certain, for however many years life saw fit to grant them. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church whose Bell Hatch himself had once donated. An irony me pointed out with no small satisfaction as she walked down the aisle in a gown of her own careful stitching. Daniel Keene, standing tall and fully recovered to give his sister away. Sheriff Elias Marsh standing as Henry's best man, with the particular pride of someone who had gambled once on a stranger, pulled from a flood and found in the end that the gamble had paid out beyond anything he could have imagined. Virgil Hatch stood trial that autumn before Judge Pemberton, and was convicted on every charge the Territorial Land Office had built against him. His syndicate's holdings seized and redistributed to the ranchers he had defrauded. His name becoming, within a year, a byword in 3 counties for the particular ruin that came to men who mistook other people's hard-won land for their own to take. Cedar Crossing rebuilt itself that summer and the summers after, the ferry landing sturdier for having been rebuilt once already, the dress shop above which Henry and me made their home busier than ever now that its future stood secure, and the jailhouse where Henry Wells served faithfully as deputy, and in time as sheriff himself when Elias Marsh finally retired to a quiet cabin up the valley, remained exactly what it had always meant to be. A place where second chances, once given, were never wasted, and where a promise made to a missing friend had, against every hard-won odd, blossomed into a love neither of its 2 careful, capable hearts had ever quite dared to hope for.